This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by Squarespace, the all in one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online.
Despite President Wilson running on the campaign motto, "If he kept us out of war" in 1916, it was already obvious that the United States would not be able to stay forever out of the Great Fray in Europe. It was a bad time for the United States Navy to be losing important naval assets to peacetime accident. And yet, little remembered events in December of 1916 and January of 1917 imperiled not just one, but two U.S. naval vessels, resulting in dramatic rescues and extraordinary salvage efforts, all on a beach in California. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Whether you've got a product to sell or an online course to curate or maybe a nonprofit that's taking donations, in today's environment, you need a good website or your business could become forgotten history. But you don't have to pay thousands of dollars to a professional to build your website. Instead, use Squarespace. And thank you, Squarespace, for sponsoring this episode of The History Guy.
Squarespace has combined its 2 decades of design experience with cutting edge AI tools to create design intelligence, which empowers you to easily design a custom website that meets your unique needs. You can choose your custom visual identity, quickly set up functions that accept payments or donations, schedule bookings, create email campaigns, or turn your online course into income. I jumped on and was able to start creating a page right away.
Don't let your business become forgotten history. Instead, build a website that deserves to be remembered. So Pocky here tells you to go to squarespace.com to get your free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/thehistoryguy and use the code thehistoryguy to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Isn't that right?
U.S. submarines of the H class were designed by the Electric Boat Company of Elizabeth, New Jersey. A scaled up version of the F class, they were coastal submarines, 150 foot 4 inches long, displacing 358 long tons on the surface with a crew of 20. Their diesel electric engines allowed a speed of 14 knots on the surface, and they were armed with four 18-inch torpedo tubes. It would be a popular design, eventually used by the US, UK, Russia, Italy, and Chile. The first three boats were authorized in fiscal year 1910, with construction beginning in 1911. Two of the boats, originally named Seawolf and Nautilus, were built by the Union Iron Works in San Francisco, and the third, originally named Garfish, by the Moran Company in Seattle. However, the Navy changed its designation system while they were under construction, and they were commissioned as the H-1, H-2, and H-3. H-3 was launched on the 3rd of July, 1913, and commissioned in January 1914. H-3 was assigned to the Pacific Fleet, patrolling off the coast of California. The difficulties of coastal travel were demonstrated on June 30th, 1915, when the H-3, traveling from San Diego to San Francisco along with the H-1 and H-2, grounded 5 miles off of Point Sur in a heavy fog. Luckily, the boat kept its orientation and did not capsize, but the Redding, California searchlight notes, for 12 hours the boat was stranded and the crew in great peril. The submarines were being accompanied by USS Cheyenne, originally built in 1899 as the Coastal Monitor USS Wyoming. In 1910, the ship had been converted to a submarine tender and renamed USS Cheyenne. After a day of being stranded, Cheyenne was able to tow H-3 off the rocks with only minor damage. But it would happen again on January 21st, 1916, when the Searchlight writes, while having a trial run in San Diego, the H-3 buried her nose in a mud bank, and the ebb tide left her lying on her side in the ooze. This time the submarine was trapped for 24 hours. By now, the submarine had a reputation, the Searchlight writes, as being unlucky. There is a long superstition that problems come in threes. The exact origin of the term is uncertain. Some etymologists assert that the number 3 is simply a significant number in many cultures and religions, and thus is assumed to have power. Others say that people have an inherent need to find patterns in random events. Another possible origin was a superstition that arose during the Crimean War, that if 3 soldiers lit their cigarettes at the same time, one of these soldiers would be killed in battle. Another suggestion is that the superstition arises from a belief in Mexico that a person suffers 3 deaths: when the body ceases to function, when the body is lowered into the ground, and finally when no one is left alive to remember you. Logistician Christopher Hitchens argues that we simply adjust our perception, and that gives the impression of the pattern. Still, superstition aside, numerous studies and scientists have insisted that there is no truth to the claim. Bad things come randomly, and a submarine cannot be unlucky. There is no reason, a scientist would argue, that because the H-3 had suffered 2 accidents, to assume it was going to have a third. But, of course, it did. The night of December 13th, 1916, U-3 was in a convoy with H-1 and H-2 and the Cheyenne, en route from Bremerton, Washington to San Diego. H3 was off of Humboldt Bay, the largest protected bay between San Francisco and Puget Sound, near Eureka, California, where the current entering the bay can be quite strong. The H3 was being pushed by a strong surf, and visibility was low in a heavy fog. Lieutenant Commander Perry Bogus, commander of the boat, was later quoted in the Redding, California Searchlight that he was taking a sounding when the boat struck. The submarine had been closer to a shoal than expected and had once again run aground. While the submarine had twice survived being run aground before, the fact is that the situation can be very dangerous. For example, the Searchlight notes that upon grounding, the boat keeled 75 degrees, causing live torpedoes to dangle from their moorings, where all they could do is watch the dangling projectiles and hope that the lashings would hold, as a live torpedo adrift in that dancing tank would have brought certain death to all hands. Additionally, water reached the batteries, causing them to release deadly and caustic chlorine gas, and the crew was forced to crowd into a single airtight compartment at the base of the conning tower. The boat had no way to signal what happened. The Long Beach Press-Telegram reported that the boat's plight was not discovered until 10 a.m. the next day by a little girl who was walking on the shore. The girl summoned help, and tugs were dispatched to help free the submarine as a great crowd gathered on shore to watch the rescue. But as of the 14th, the Press-Telegram was expressing concern. A Coast Guard crew from the Humboldt Bay Life-Saving Station had gotten close enough to the submarine to fire a line, which had gone across the stern of the boat, but no one had come out of the submarine to fix the line, which could be used for rescue. This caused the belief that the crew were injured, the paper reported. The Cheyenne attempted to reach the submarine, but the Press-Telegram writes, she ran past the first line of breakers, but evidently fearing disaster, soon withdrew out to sea. And the boat was still being pounded by the surf, the Press-Telegram continued. At 12:56 p.m., after the craft had been buffeted and rolled by the sea for several hours, the belief was expressed by persons watching the ship from shore that the superstructure was being broken up. The crew was, the paper opined, in grave peril. But hopes were raised as a single man came out on deck and tried to fix the Coast Guard line, which required that he cut away a part of the superstructure. He failed, but 5 more men came out, but they also failed and went back below. By the 15th, however, the Searchlight was able to report that the line had been secured and the crew rescued using a breacher's buoy, a rescue apparatus that brings men in along a line. The coasties of the life-saving service had saved the squids, but the H-3 was still stranded. Writing in a 2009 edition of a text about U.S. Navy Marine salvage entitled Mud, Muscle, and Miracles, Navy Captain Charles A. Bartholomew writes, an unsuccessful salvage attempt was made by Cheyenne and the tug Iroquois. Shortly after Christmas, following standard practice, the commandant of the Mare Island Navy Yard, who had responsibility for the salvage, called for bids to refloat the stranded submarine. 6 bids were received, but the Navy determined 5 to be too high, and the lowest, just $18,000, to be so low that the Navy was skeptical that the company could do the work. Accordingly, Bartholomew writes, the Navy decided to undertake the salvage itself. Their plan was to pull the H-3 to freedom by harnessing the massive 21,000 horsepower of the flagship of the Pacific Submarine Flotilla, the protected cruiser USS Milwaukee. Milwaukee was brought down from San Francisco when the salvage effort began on January 12th. Milwaukee was a St. Louis-class protected cruiser, one of 3, laid down in 1902 at Union Iron Works in San Francisco and commissioned in 1906. She was 426 foot 6 inches long, with a beam of 66 feet, and carried a complement of 673 officers and men. But as a larger vessel, weighing in at 9,700 long tons, she had a relatively deep draft, more than 22 feet, which offered its own risks among the same shoals that had stranded the H-3. Reportedly, local sailors, familiar with the surf, warned against the attempt, realizing the danger posed to such a large vessel among the breakers and shoals. The Boston Globe reported that within 40 or 50 miles of this part of the coast, 6 other vessels had struck shore during the last few years, and none of them had been saved. The Navy recognized the risk with the strong breakers, a risk made much greater by the fact that the Milwaukee was going to be affixed to 2 2-inch tow lines attached to the H-3. Bartholomew writes, a ship not designed for towing, with a heavy loaded tow wire made up near her stern, can easily find herself in irons, unable to maneuver. Milwaukee was under the temporary command of Lieutenant William F. Newton, and her crew was reduced to between 420 and 500 men. The Navy's answer to the problem was to have the Cheyenne and the Navy tug Iroquois attach 2 tow lines at the bow, where they could keep the Milwaukee out of trouble. After pulling for 2 days, the Associated Press explains what came next. The tidal current and the weight of the heavy steel hawser that was fast to the submarine proved stronger than the combined power of the 3 vessels. And all were being dragged forward when the hawser to the Cheyenne snapped and left little Iroquois to battle alone with the tide that was weeping the Milwaukee into the breakers. Realizing the danger to his boat, the Associated Press writes that Bosun Frank Bruce, commander of the Iroquois, held on as long as he dared and then saved his vessel from the Milwaukee's fate by cutting the hawser. Newton also perceived the risk and attempted to have the two hawsers to the H-3 cut, but the Associated Press writes it was too late. The highest bid for the salvage of H-3 had been $73,000. Having determined that to be too high, the Navy had instead endangered a $4 million vessel. The vessel with a 22-foot draft was now stuck on outer shoals where there was just 12 feet of water. Newspapers seemed to disagree as to the fate of Milwaukee. The Boston Globe reported that tugs were sent to the assistance of the Milwaukee, which was said to be in no immediate danger. But the Associated Press reported that officers on shore reported that it was hardly possible that the $4 million cruiser would ever float again. The ship's false bottom was flooded in order to anchor her and hopefully protect her from the surf. But there was an immediate problem, as the ship's list made it impossible to launch any of the cruiser's boats. Now some 500 men's lives were in danger. The Associated Press reported for nearly 10 hours the crew waited on the lee side for help to come from shore. When the sun broke through the fog that enveloped the vessel since dawn, it was seen that all on board were wearing life preservers. The Brooklyn Eagle reported that breakers were spraying over the warship's superstructure, and the incessant pounding of the waves was driving the vessel further ashore in the sand. The Milwaukee had listed to an angle of 20 degrees, with low tide in mid-afternoon, and every succeeding hour made the cruiser's position more perilous. Once again, the Navy needed the help of the Coast Guard. While the cutter was dispatched, the same life-saving station that had saved the men of the H-3 were able to affix lines, although the Eagle reported with the roll of the vessel, the trolleys would slacken and then straighten out, dropping the buoys with their human burden into the breakers, alternatively hoisting them into the air. But the coasties once again succeeded, and all crew were brought out safely, including the ship's mascot, a dog named Sea Rover. The only injury came when one of Milwaukee's boats had been turned over in the tide. Although initial reports were that a sailor had drowned, in fact the man had only broken his shoulder. The crew had been saved, but if there was hope of rescuing the vessel, it was soon dashed as the surf continued to drive the ship inland. By January 16th, the Los Angeles Times reported that the USS Milwaukee is now officially considered a total loss and that no attempt will be made to float her unless the plans of those in charge here are altered radically by high officials of the Navy Department, was the announcement here today. The Milwaukee was a total loss. For salvage, a line of the Northwest Pacific Railroad ran to a lumber mill nearby where the ship had stranded. The line was extended and a trestle was built. The LA Times reported crews will be placed aboard her and her guns, her equipment, her boilers, furnace, engines, all her hardware, in fact, everything movable, will be taken from the cruiser, loaded directly into boxcars at the cruiser's side, and the cars sealed and consigned to Mare Island. It was an extraordinary effort. The Times reported that this will be one of the most novel bits of salvage ever attempted, and will amount practically to shipping the Milwaukee to Mare Island by rail. As for the H-3, the Navy decided to accept the original $18,000 bid by a general construction contractor named Mercer Fraser. The process was, Bartholomew opined, imaginative. Pilings were driven alongside the submarine, which were used to anchor jacks, which lifted the boat from the sand. A timber railing was then built, and the submarine was towed by jack over a mile, where it could be refloated in Humboldt Bay. H-3 was refloated and later operated as a flagship of Submarine Division 6. The boat was finally decommissioned in 1922. Of course, that meant that the Navy could always have saved the H-3 for a reasonable price without risking the Milwaukee.
The H-3 never ran aground again after the third time, but it's hard to say what that means about problems coming in threes, as the total loss of USS Milwaukee seemed to have had to have counted as number 4. In fact, the events represented the sorts of challenges about going to sea that had faced humans ever since they first went to sea, but it also represented the relative inexperience that the U.S. Navy had in marine salvage at the time. Bartholomew wrote that the cost, the loss of Milwaukee, was high. The challenges faced by the salvage problem of the H-3 were not fully appreciated by the Navy officers involved because they lacked experience in salvage seamanship, and so made decisions that, however well-intentioned, proved costly. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo.